Hey everybody, and welcome to the Tausken review. Today I'll be taking a look at Subnautica Below Zero. I loved the original Subnautica, so when I heard that a sequel was coming, I was thrilled. However, given how unique and interesting Subnautica was for its time, how would a sequel be and could it actually match the original game? For those who have never played the original, Subnautica is an ocean-based survival adventure game. There's a story component to it that's a very heavy piece of the game, but it overall is very much a survival game. In either game, you've either crash landed or gone to this faraway oceanic planet where you're basically forced to survive on your own. At first, things will be pretty slow. You won't move very fast, you'll be relegated to catching fish by simply just swimming up to them and grabbing them, but later on you'll find yourself with equipment and vehicles to help you with this task in your own underwater base as the centerpiece of your overall experience. Below Zero retains the same fun, relaxing, and rewarding experience of progressing and exploring the oceans and building up your tools like the original. There's nothing quite like starting the game out where you're simply forced to just simply swim, and then getting things like oxygen tanks and other things so you can go farther, getting tools to allow you to move and traverse the oceans faster, and vehicles to the point that it feels like you're beginning to conquer the underwater with your own base. They have made some changes, like the progression system in this game is substantially faster than the original. You'll find most of the tools that you need to kind of get going and get some of the fast moving things much faster than you did in the original Subnautica. It's a little bit more streamlined in that regard, so you'll be getting to your base and some of the vehicles and things much faster than you did in the original game. Ultimately, I found though that Below Zero was a little bit less of an enjoyable experience compared to the original. It's not bad, but it feels like a shorter DLC sold as a standalone sequel. Don't get me wrong, there's a ton of content here, and it's definitely more than a simple DLC. I spent around 20 hours completing the story and exploring the oceans, but it's incredibly small compared to the original game with far fewer biomes than in the last game. On top of that, the biomes that we have feel less interesting than the ones found in the original with less links to them. One thing I loved about the original was going to new biomes and finding new species of fish and things that I hadn't seen before. But in this game, it oftentimes feels like you don't really find that. You'll find new biomes that'll have new pieces of terrain or flora and things, but they really lack the new fish and other components and monsters and things that are really fleshing it out. As a result, it feels like when you have far fewer biomes and a lot of the content is being reused from the original game, you're not really getting much out of your money. There is still some new stuff, but the fact that they reuse so much content here is a little bit of a disappointment. And it feels like there really should be more other stuff because they're reusing all that stuff. A lot of the tools, building mechanics, base building things, and other things are all being reused from the original game. You'll run into a ton of the different same types of fish and things, so it's kind of like, what exactly am I getting here? And then where they made changes, I don't think they really did it right. In Below Zero, they removed the Cyclops and replaced it with the Sea Truck. The Sea Truck is sort of like a combination of the two. When it doesn't have any modules, it's kind of like a Sea Moth. It's faster, it moves around a little bit more agile, but you can make it into more of a Cyclops by adding on different modules. But I never really felt like it really had that same power of the Cyclops. You can mix and match different modules like the Fabricator to build things, Aquarium to pick up fish as you're moving, or storage, and then there's some lesser or useful modules. It's just less badass and less interesting than the Cyclops really felt. They also changed up a bit of how like the tools and powers that you have on the vehicles work. Like in the original with the Cyclops, you would have things like running silent, or you'd have a shield and different components that would help you survive against Leviathans. But here, I never really felt that sense of danger while moving my vehicle around. It was incredibly easy to dispel of Leviathans and other things because you get an ability pretty early on that just zaps them away. It kind of makes the whole thing feel a bit boring and uninteresting. One of the things I really loved about the original was like that sense of dread as you explore some deep underwater cavern in your submarine, running silent, trying not to get noticed by the Leviathan cruising by. They've also made some changes that make vehicles very difficult to use. Like in this game, it's very vertical with caverns everywhere. It's very hard to fit your sea truck as you're trying to cruise around, especially if you've got a prawn on the back. And this can make the whole experience feel a bit frustrating. As the player, you're trying to use your tools and your abilities, but the game's sort of actively punishing you for using them. The original game had these open locations that were very deep, sometimes going down to 1,000 meters past, and this would make the whole experience pretty fun because you could take your vehicle and kind of cruise down and then get out of it. But here it's very hard to fit the sea truck into some areas, especially some of the late game areas where you have to go down these tiny little caverns and then you're bashing into rocks and things every second. It makes the whole experience very frustrating for using vehicles. The prawn also makes a return, however the progression and balancing is kind of off in this game, so the point that you get the prawn is so late in the game that you've effectively almost beat the game, and all of the large ore deposits are so far down into the ground that it makes using the prawn completely useless, because you have to get into your sea truck and then bash into 5,000 things trying to get it down into those caverns, and it just makes the whole experience feel like, what's the point? A lot of these things just don't feel well thought out, and that's, I think, the common problem with this game, which I'll get into even more in the next part here talking about story. Much like its predecessor, Below Zero is sort of an uncover the mystery type of story to its exploration gameplay. You play as Robin, who has to come and find out what happened to her sister Sam. It's more hands-on and in your face than the original, with full-on NPCs and characters you'll interact with, but I'm not sure that's really necessarily a good thing. The dialogue is pretty rough and the characters that you run into aren't that interesting. I heard that the game did have sort of a jumbled mess of early access where they threw out the story multiple times, so that's probably part of the problem, but it just feels like the story here just isn't really that well thought out. It's basically two intertwining stories that mix together throughout the course of the game, and then one of them sort of overtakes the other that becomes the main thread that goes forward. Neither of which really feel as refined as the original game. It's, I think, in some ways more in your face, which is great. It's more interactive than the original game, which was more kind of like reading things and seeing things. But I just don't think that the story here really is doing a whole lot that really adds to the game much. These new story sections also come with a heavy focus on land, something that was not very much in the original game. With new temperature mechanics, so the longer you're on land, the more difficult it becomes as the temperature begins to drop and your character starts to freeze. This will force you to find things like heat warming plants, or bring food to warm yourself up, or bring clothing that will warm you up. This is by far, I think, one of the worst additions to the franchise. The land sections are large, boring areas that are just uninteresting. It completely misses the mysterious, fun, interesting exploration parts of the underwater areas and throws them out for these boring, snowy deserts, basically. They do give you a Snow Fox, which is basically a Star Wars speeder, but the controls are so bad, it's almost useless on land. You'll be smashing into things constantly. It's like trying to control a freight train. These new land sections just have nothing going for them, which is really a disappointment because they're such a huge part of this game. There's a few facilities and places to explore, but largely they're just flat, bland, snowy areas with nothing but a few monsters to attack you. Sometimes there's a few plants or things you'll run into, but it's just not a whole lot. This even gets worse when the game at one point sends you to try and find a mission where you'll have to go and find a particular iceberg and a facility on it. However, there's no real landmarks or obvious pointers, and then the game throws these giant snowstorms at you, blocking your vision while you're just swimming between giant icebergs trying to figure out which one has the objective you're looking for. These mechanics just plain suck, and add nothing interesting to the gameplay, and completely throw out the fun underwater areas for this boring land section. And finally, from a graphics perspective, Below Zero does a pretty decent job. Most of the areas that you go to do have a lot of colorful aspects to them that are fairly nice graphically. But I did wish, like I said earlier, that there was maybe a little more variety, more biomes, more interesting ones, but the graphic department of what is here is pretty good. The soundtrack has a new composer that does a pretty decent job. It's a little bit different than the original, but it has very much the same style. Overall, Below Zero gets a 6 out of 10. I would say probably like a 6.9 out of 10 if I was going to go on a more granular scale. It's a fun game for people who enjoyed the original game, and despite my complaints, I did enjoy it for the 20 hours I played. Ultimately, though, I feel like it fails to surpass or even match its predecessor and somehow manages to make many areas of the game, such as progression, vehicles, especially the sea truck where moving the Sea Moth and Cyclops, far worse. The on-land sections of this game add nothing but boredom and manage to slow the game's pace down massively. I still would recommend the game for people who liked the original. There's definitely some improvements here, right? Like they've added things like plants so that when you go underwater without a vehicle, you can click on them, which will allow you to stay down there for longer so that you don't have to go up as often, making it so that you don't have to just have vehicles 24/7. And that stuff is great, but I feel like a lot of the changes, like the biomes are just less interesting, the cavernous nature of the game with less open spaces just makes it so much less fun and feels like it's just a worse version of the original. I had so much more fun with the original game because of the amount of variety in the biomes and the sea creature life, but in this game there just really isn't anything like that. It just feels like a worse version. So, I would say if you liked the original game, pick it up, sure. It's going to be a fun game that's going to expand upon the original and allow you to play it. You just got to treat it like a DLC more than a fully fledged sequel.